Hi, Tom. Good to see you. My name's Jack Schickler. I'm a reporter at CoinDesk. This is Tom Duff Gordon, the Vice President of International Policy at Coinbase, an organization with which we are often confused, but is completely different. If someone could think of a few new brand names in the crypto space, that would be absolutely excellent, because otherwise everyone gets confused with everyone else. We're here to talk about the next European Commission and what role Web3 should take place. So we've already heard a lot about the EU having agreed its landmark crypto law, MiCA, and some of the kind of teething troubles we're going through in implementing those. But we'll probably come back to that later in the conversation. But let's start with saying, you know, assuming MiCA is out of the way, assuming it's a success, what should be next for EU policymakers? What should they now start to focus on in this space?
Thanks, Jack. It's good to be here with you all. That's the first time I think CoinDesk and Coinbase have been confused for each other. Anyway, good to hear. So look, the first thing I want to say, and it's been said many times before, but I think it is worth repeating, that MiCA is a terrific kind of step forward, and it's a huge achievement. One thing we forget, and part of my job at Coinbase is to travel the world and look at all the different regimes outside of the US, many of whom have not got as far as MiCA. So one thing we forget is just how kind of, you know, how much foresight they had in Europe here at the Commission, you know, several years ago to start thinking about MiCA and to get to the stage where we've got to. So huge credit for that. And I think as others have said already, this provides regulatory clarity. There are a lot of jurisdictions and regions in the world where we don't have that. We now have regulatory clarity here in the EU, and that's incredibly important for investment and actors in the space. In your question, you said, you know, what do we do now that MiCA's out of the way? I don't know if we can say MiCA's done yet, in the sense that there's a certain amount of questions around interpretation, level playing field, a very good discussion on that kind of earlier on. There's a very deep and I think thoughtful level 2 process, and I think we're just a third of the way through that with more to come. And there are national kind of consultations and things as well. So there's a lot of work that still has to happen. And no doubt at one point we'll start thinking about gaps in MiCA 2, you know, and I think we've talked a little bit already about NFTs and DeFi, staking, some of these other topics. But I think at the heart of your question, and what I really wanted to say today, is that I think we need to be the mechanics on MiCA. I think one of the panelists before talked about, please engage with the consultations. I think it was Esma, lift up the bonnet and kind of get involved. So I think we all in the industry need to be helpful mechanics in terms of, you know, engaging and talking about, you know, the difficulties with implementation. But I also think we need to be visionaries as well. And we need to remember, why did we do MiCA? So we did MiCA because we wanted to kind of protect consumers and market integrity, financial stability. But we also did it, I think, because we wanted to foster innovation. We wanted to foster competitiveness. We wanted to see tech leadership here in the EU. And so I think one thing that I'm, you know, interested to discuss in parallel with those regulatory technical discussions is how do we reconnect kind of MiCA with Web3? You know, how do we think about the things that matter to the next commission? So there's European Parliament elections next year. There's going to be a new commission. How do we think more strategically and be more visionaries about what are the issues that matter thematically to Europe, whether that's the ESG kind of agenda, whether that's competitiveness, whether it's tech leadership, whether it's strategic autonomy, whether it's capital markets union. How can the technology actually kind of like help to provide solutions in a lot of these different kind of, you know, spaces? I just want to give you one example of that. It's a project that we're involved in at Coinbase. The Green Deal is obviously, you know, hugely important kind of here, and underneath the Green Deal in Europe, there are a number of initiatives. One of those initiatives is there to promote a circular economy. And so there will be requirements for digital product passports from next year. So all physical goods circulating within the internal market will have to come with a digital product passport. And a bit like a human passport, that will have information about the product such that we can figure out what was the carbon footprint, where did it come from, what were the working conditions associated with the manufacture of that, all the way through the life cycle from production through to kind of, you know, disposal. And actually blockchain, which is a kind of immutable kind of record and a transparent one that everyone can see, And Web3 could provide a terrific kind of solution there. And so we're working with a number of companies, one in particular, such that when a piece of clothing is sold, from next year onwards in the EU, effectively you'll then get a kind of a code, a barcode, and you'll be able to kind of scan it and create a digital twin, an NFT of the piece of clothing that you've just bought. And that will give you all of the information from an ESG kind of perspective, which will help people think more about the sustainability of products, the circular economy. But actually it's a win-win because it will also create a kind of a unique connection between the producer and the end consumer. And that I think is quite interesting from a commercial and a marketing kind of perspective. So just one example of how I think, whilst we've got this really important kind of technical work to do with Mika, I feel like in parallel, we need to kind of look up and ensure that we are thinking to ourselves, really creatively, how can we best use this technology? Because having the foundation, the regulation, that shouldn't be the destination.
Yeah.
That should be the kind of a gateway that kind of helps us as we try and, use it to ensure that the EU has tech leadership. And then final point, I think the US very much, I think, stole a march on the rest of the world with Web2. There are 4 or 5 huge US companies that dominate that space. We're on the cusp of Web3 and, cryptography, decentralized ID, self-hosted wallets. These are the building blocks of kind of Web3. And I think if the EU is able to kind of lean into that innovation, I think they'll have a stake in that ecosystem, which we think is really exciting and should be exciting over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to each of those points you've raised there because there's enough material to fill our 25 minutes easily. One of the issues you raised there is the digital product passport and this idea of having kind of a blockchain-based solution that can help you monitor a product supply chain, which you're right, there'd be a market for, at least in the European Commission, would be dead keen on that. But it's definitely been tried before. People like IBM, Maersk have tried out their TradeLens project. And then abandoned it last year, which was supposed to do something quite similar. And it hasn't got off the ground, even with those massive companies behind it. What do you think the obstacles are to succeeding with that kind of initiative? And are they actually regulatory, the obstacles? And if so, what do you want regulators and the Commission to do differently in order to encourage them?
Yeah, I'm not sure they're regulatory, the obstacles, and you gave a couple of examples, but I can think of lots more where government departments, whether it's in the EU or it's in the UK or other places, have said, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if we put all of the healthcare data on a new system, or why don't we take land records? And they've tried that in India and other places. And they've even tried, tokenizing securities and those types of things in markets like Australia. And a number of these things have been great ideas, but they haven't kind of come to fruition. I just think that we have to remind ourselves that we're at early stage in this technology, that we've got to keep trying, we've got to keep innovating. It's for the private sector, I think, to actually, drive that innovation. But I think where the public sector can help is potentially providing sandboxes and kind of nudges and incentives, to do that and to encourage people to come forward, whether it's for a hackathon or some kind of sandbox. So I think the onus to drive the innovation is on the private sector side. I think the huge cost associated with moving from traditional finance systems or traditional ledgering systems into the blockchain is not to be underestimated. It takes a huge amount of time, and the penalty for getting a lot of things wrong here can be kind of severe. So we have to move incrementally, but we do think that the technology does offer just game-changing kind of potential advances. So we need to keep iterating.
And you obviously must talk to people over here and as well as in the UK about the policy changes they can make. The last year has been a difficult one for crypto. Do you find the kind of reputational problems that we've seen over the last year make that conversation more difficult? And how do you try and overcome those kind of skepticism? We've seen a lot of companies going bankrupt. We've seen a lot of people who are now in jail. Let's be honest, this is it doesn't affect the whole sector, but for the man on the street and for normies who don't necessarily know a huge amount about this sector, that's what they think of. What's the best way you can kind of get around that kind of skepticism when you're in those kind of conversations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in 2 words, it's kind of regulation and education. But just to kind of go back to last year, I think we in the industry, we need to show some kind of humility because, clearly we had a black eye. 3 different sets of events. We had the 3 arrows, we also had Terra Luna, and then we had FTX at the back end of last year. And I think the combination of all of those things, did rock credibility and trust, in the sector. And that has put us behind, particularly if I think of the US. I mean, I think we were marching towards kind of, some congressional activity and some regulatory clarity, and that's all been kind of pushed back. And then wherever I go in the world, inevitably, there is now an air of kind of, suspicion and concern around the industry, which I think, emanates in large part from 2022. But I will say that when you dig into that, kind of crypto itself, a lot of the time was not at fault, right? So if you look at the FTX, I mean, lots of people have said this, so nothing new, but I mean, there was just no corporate governance at all that was kind of discernible. I think you could point to regulatory failings there. There was kind of, or there was alleged, misuse of client funds and kind of basic fraud. These types of things happen in traditional finance. So, that wasn't kind of crypto kind of per se. And then I think, we learned a little bit about algorithmic stablecoins, not that as a category, they're a bad thing. And it's just fiat backed, which work. I think there is probably a market for algorithmic stablecoins, but we need to be, very sensible and regulate robustly, the mechanism that achieves parity between, the token and what it's referencing. So we learned a lot of things. There was also no spillover into traditional finance, and that was good. That was nice to see. So I think whilst we have to have humility and, certainly we've lost some credibility, I don't think that, necessarily we need to keep looking backwards. We need to look forwards. And one of the positives, I think, from, if we can take a positive from last year, is that there has been this accelerated push for regulation, particularly at the global level, right? So we've talked a lot about MiCA, but one of the things that's really impressive about MiCA is it's become a template globally, right, for the work that the G20 have done through the FSB and also some of the IOSCO kind of work. But that's incredibly important because, crypto markets are global markets. They're 24/7 markets. And we need to, the way that we build kind of trust is, I think, having a regulatory baseline. And I think it was terrific news that recently, India managed to, at the G20 summit in New Delhi just recently, they managed to get sign off on the high level kind of principles. And I think the key thing there is that some markets, some huge geos around the world considered banning. Partly, Jack, is because of what you were saying. I think the concerns around money laundering and scams and some of the issues in 2022. I think the kind of the inflection point that we saw through the G20 process is now it's about having a baseline and common rules across different jurisdictions rather than prohibiting. Because I think when you prohibit, you create pockets, soft pockets for regulatory arbitrage. And so I think India deserve a lot of credit for the way that they steered that to the outcome they came. I think the other part of the answer would be we've got to do a better job in the industry of explaining what it is that we kind of do and why there's utility to some of these tokens, why it's not just, all short-term investments.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I hear a lot when I talk to regulators is, well, we like the blockchain technology, but we don't like tokens. And you hear that a lot, and you can kind of understand why they say that. And I think it's our job to explain that you can't disassociate those two things, right? That it's the tokens that really kind of like power the blockchains, or the tokens that provide the utility for the projects that are built on the blockchains. And so it's a heuristic that kind of we like to say, oh, the technology's good, but the speculations and tokens are bad. I think that comment we need to kind of unpack better for people. So I think it's a combination of, regulation, hopefully the global principles filter down, MiCA kind of propagates and its kind of influence. And then I think in the industry, we've got to continue explaining and educating.
And you mentioned, that the lack of progress in the US with legislating for anything that looks like MiCA, although there's certainly been some legislative proposals out there. How should people in Europe feel about that failure? Because for me, it's a bit of a mixed bag. You could say, well, we've done our job, we've regulated, we can be the home of safe crypto now and beat the rest of the world. Or you could say, what's the use in Europe regulating if the other major economic jurisdiction in the world, the US, hasn't done its homework? Should we be cheering on kind of US progress in this area, or should we be kind of hoping the EU keeps its leadership?
Well, I guess it depends a bit which side of the Atlantic you sit on. But I think here in this room, I think people should be proud about, what everybody has done, public sector, private sector, to come together to create the regulatory clarity. And I think it provides a huge platform and an advantage. I think there are various reports out there in the market now, and I think one was referred to earlier today, that suggests that the vacuum and the uncertainty in the US is driving crypto business and activity out of the US and to other places. And so it comes back to what I was saying before, really, which is, if the EU has aspirations towards strategic autonomy, competitiveness, tech leadership, these types of things, then, whilst we should never, point our fingers and, be happy that things aren't moving as fast as they should be in the US, at least we can kind of be, satisfied that we've got a good start here and we've got a good basis on which to kind of create jobs, economic growth, prosperity, and effectively just use Web3 and use the technology to transform all sorts of, areas of the public sphere, not just financial services, but kind of more broadly.
Yeah. On an earlier panel, Katie was talking about kind of Coinbase's implementation of MiCA and how that will work. Coinbase, if I can put it this way, in Europe, you're all over the place. You've got recognition in numerous EU countries and the UK. I think just the other day it was announced you've got registration in Spain. Congratulations. The assumption under MiCA is that companies will have just one home and deal with just one regulator, and the whole point is that enables you to work throughout Europe. I know you haven't taken any firm decision about where that home will be, but what are the kind of things you'll be thinking about when you think which regulator do we want to be dealing with, which country do we want to be in as our main base?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've been thinking about it hard because, as you say, the leap forward with MiCA is that you with one license, you can passport across all 27 member states, 500 million people, and you don't necessarily have to duplicate all of the internal resources and infrastructure related with that supervisory engagement. You can kind of just do it in one place. So I think it's likely that we will decide to have one location from which to kind of hub our supervisory kind of activities from. We haven't yet decided which that hub is. And we're taking our time to think really carefully through, what is the right location. So we want to have a regulator that we think is a trusted and a kind of a tier one regulator. We want to have access to talent. And then the third thing, which particularly I think is important, is a government that is supportive, not necessarily just of the company. I think that doesn't matter so much, but supportive of the vision and of the technology and of the space and of the tech sector. And I think that's important, particularly when we feel we're going to be moving into kind of MiCA 2 potentially. And then again, we want to, expand the use cases of this kind of technology. So, we will probably come to a determination, in the next, several weeks, but we haven't made that decision yet. But yes, you're right. I think we'll choose one supervisory hub, but that doesn't mean that we will cease all operations across Europe, because, I think there are a number of very exciting kind of markets in Europe where there's a lot of, Web3 activity happening. So we'll want to have exposure to those two.
So a decision within the next few weeks. I look forward to hearing more about that. You also mentioned the fact that Europe lost the march on Web2. Clearly, all the big web companies in the world are mainly US, some of them Chinese. And very few of them, if any, are European, and that's a big thorn in the side of a lot of EU policymakers, and for good reason. Do you worry that they look at Coinbase and think you are an American company, you've come over to Europe trying to do business here within the single market? Do you worry that actually that reflection acts against Coinbase because they see you as the next Google, and with all the kind of negative as well as positive things that brings?
No, we haven't had that reception actually. We've had very good constructive conversations with the governments and the regulators that we've kind of engaged with, and I think and I would say this rightly, I think the important thing is to have the ecosystem, right? And I think, we are a component in the ecosystem. There are other centralized exchanges that do a terrific job. I think it's important that you have competition. But to the extent that, if I was a EU member state, I would want to have an ecosystem, and I'd want to have, actors in that who are leaning into regulation, that are, innovating, that have leading edge, capabilities in different places. And I think, that kind of rising tide is going to lift all ships. So, again, we see ourselves as a centralized exchange. We're not sure that, that is going to be the end of the journey. And we're kind of infrastructure provider as well. So we just launched earlier this year. Some of you will have seen a blockchain, so a layer 2, a scaling blockchain that sits above Ethereum. And that's an example of some of the things that we try and do to try and foment kind of activity in local ecosystems. So we've got, thousands of developers that are building projects on Base, our blockchain, and we've got thousands of those based in the EU. So to some extent, a lot of the work that we do is to provide, the infrastructure. So, we have wallet as a service, so white label wallets. We've got a blockchain. We've got, all sorts of developer tools to allow people to grow. So I think part of our contribution when we're in Europe, when we're in the ecosystem, is to kind of help local players and local talent to try and scale, and so hopefully that offsets a perception that it's the Americans coming to dominate.
Very good. I started out by saying, Mika's done what's next, and that was a bit forward of me because, we've already discussed on previous panels some of the difficulties and issues still remaining with Mika. I'd quite like to get your view on what Mika does actually mean, because I've heard some companies say, some big crypto companies say, Mika mainly deals with stablecoins. There's two types of stablecoin, asset reference tokens. There isn't a use case for them. They won't exist. And then there's e-money tokens, which are kind of payment stablecoins tied to a currency. And on current trends, if nothing is done, they could all be delisted this time next year when Mika comes in, because none of them is currently complying. Do you kind of share that pessimism? Do you think Mika will be a success? Do you think we're going to see the end of stablecoin activity in Europe?
No, I don't. But I do think you touched on an important point, which is I think Mika we support. We think it's a very good piece of kind of regulation. But clearly it's not all perfect. And if there were some areas in it that we think, well, there's some things that are missing, obviously, that previous panels have talked about. But if there were some areas in it that may not do quite what they were intended to do, we might point to the stablecoin kind of provisions. And I think just stepping back for a second, I think we might be at an inflection point with stablecoins as a kind of breakout use case, right, for this kind of technology in financial services. There was a report that came out just a few weeks back by a UK hedge fund called Brevin Had that said Visa settled about 11 trillion in transactions in 2022, and stable coins, 10.6 or 10.5. So almost at parity with Visa, stable coins kind of globally, which I think is an extraordinary statistic. Clearly, people are doing different things, right, with the stable coins versus using the payment network. But stable coins are now 7 times, 8 times the size of kind of PayPal. You see Visa and PayPal moving into the stable coin kind of like territory, which I think is extremely kind of noteworthy. And we've now got kind of regulation in a number of different markets on stablecoins. So I think stablecoins is a really exciting space to watch. Effectively, we're taking fiat currency and we're putting it on kind of supersonic Web3 kind of internet rails. And I think, the possibilities for cross-border transfers and just to increase efficiency and reduce costs, I think are really exciting. But coming back to Mika, we'll have to kind of see, whether indeed the rules create the necessary conditions for a flourishing stable coin market in the EU, particularly for non-euro stable coins, where some of the caps and some of the other prohibitions I think are quite tough. There's a ban on providing interest because I think there's a concern about creating too much competition with bank deposits. But personally, and I'm actually an ex-banker, but personally I'm in favor of kind of competition in the deposit space. And then there are capital requirements for stable coins, which are relatively elevated. I think they derive from some of the money legislation, but when you think about a fiat-backed stablecoin that is really just backed with cash and short-term treasuries, the financial risk that you're taking is very, very, very small. It's actually an operational risk. So a 2 or a 3% capital requirement, which is kind of analogous to a kind of leverage ratio in a bank, where a bank, has an extremely kind of complicated hierarchy of assets that they're supporting, some of which are secured, but some of which are not secured. You kind of think that potentially that those requirements are quite hard. So we've done some of our own analysis on that, and we think the number could be lower. But let's see. As I say, I think Mika is a terrific start. I think they get, you know, almost everything right, but you put your finger on the stablecoin issue, which I think is an exciting one generally, but it's one in which, you know, we'll have to see the extent to which that really takes off in the EU.
Yeah. So I see our time is ticking down. I'm just going to leave you with a very short question. If you could add or remove one thing from Mika, what would it be?
Okay. Oh gosh. I think maybe just quickly on staking. I just clarifying what staking is. I just really worry. Staking is so important, right? Because proof of stake blockchains are the fundamental kind of bedrock of all of the kind of the Web3 ecosystem, all of those dApps that are built on top, kind of, you know, all settled to either a layer 2 or Ethereum or another proof of stake blockchain. Staking is just the really basic kind of pass-through kind of protocol kind of validation that you do. And I know that you know, trying to describe staking in 10 seconds is not easy. But it's a very low risk activity that just has to do with kind of securing the network via validating, you know, the transactions, participating in the consensus mechanism. Just describing what that is, I think, would be helpful, because I worry that there's a lot of confusion with regulators about staking as a lending product, staking as some kind of managed investment product, etc. Yeah. And genuinely, you know, if we just get the taxonomy right, and I think if regulators are able to move in that direction in markets over the next, I think that'll be extremely helpful. Yeah. Just because I think moving kind of too fast and too bluntly with staking, and we're seeing that in a number of international markets, by the way. I think that would be problematic for the development of the whole space.
So we need extra rules on staking. I've heard you say it. I've heard Christine Lagarde of the ECB say it. So, you know, if both of those great minds think alike, it must be true. Thank you very much, Tom Duff Gordon, for your time. Thank you very much for listening to us. And I think we now have to move on to the next panel. So we could talk about this for hours, but I see Tommaso jostling us gently to move on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks.